Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Taylor, and joining me here in a few seconds will be Tanner. But first, we need to shout out some new patrons. Ina, Brenda, and Jacob. Thank you for joining us on Patreon. We hope you enjoy all of the bonus episodes over there, and thanks for supporting the show. We greatly appreciate it. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and bring in Tanner. Tanner, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing relatively well. It was a
Nice.
long week at work. We started the third quarter of our classes, of the classes I teach, is an accelerated session so that they're finished in time for the beginning of university in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So those are really long days for the students and for me, the teacher. We have classes from 9 to 5 with, a lunch break in the middle.
That's like a full day of work, actually.
Which is different from the normal schedule.
Right.
So those are long weeks, and I'm teaching it's kind of a mixed level class. They're both high levels, but there's a definite divide. It's long days, so I don't really have as much time for other stuff. That's kind of one of the reasons our bonus production has been a little bit lower recently. But I'm enjoying it. It's kind of making me expand my teaching a little bit, having to be very, very project oriented and having to stay on top of everything because everything's moving so fast.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, it's like I like being a little bit busier. I think it helps me manage my time better when I have more stuff to do.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to make a schedule when you can fill it.
I mean, we do also have more students than we've had. I've got 9 total students compared to the 3 that I had previously.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work, but as long as you don't let it bury you, you're fine. So I'm doing okay. I'm tired, but I'm doing pretty well.
Nice.
How about you?
Oh, pretty good. Work's busy like always, but at least we have a short week this week. A random Tuesday off for July 4th, so that's fun.
I like having that actually in the middle. For my purposes right now with classes, it's actually very nice to have that right in the middle of the week rather than a long weekend. I'd much prefer that.
It's not great for my schedule. But I don't know. I'll take a day off. That's fine, even if it is Tuesday. So
we can record a bonus episode.
We can record a bonus episode on Tuesday. Look at us go. That's how we'll celebrate America's independence.
Yeah.
As far as media stuff, I started a new Max Hastings book, The Secret War, Spies, Codes, and Guerrillas from 1939 to 45. I like it because it's not like James Bond spy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it's just really dumb people doing dumb things and trying to get secrets out of people or trying to shake people down for money. It's amazing.
Not as much sex and cocktails.
There is some for sure. There's definitely individuals that the Bond stories are based off of and stuff. But on the whole, these people didn't get a lot of intelligence all the time, and these people weren't very intelligent sometimes. So it's very interesting. He spends a lot of time looking at countries like Italy and Japan. And
mm-hmm.
I've never thought about what Italy and Japan's intelligence services were doing in World War II, but they definitely exist.
Mm-hmm.
And then also learning more about what the NKVD did and how successful they were and some of their methods that they used. So
not exactly doing this for fun.
Definitely playing to win the game in their case. So that's been really interesting. I've just started. I'm only about probably 50, 60 pages in. And already it's been great. He does such a good job of developing characters out of it. So it's fun. It's a good way. I think he has a very approachable way to read history. It's not boring, at least. What about you?
In all my busyness, I have found some time to do other stuff. I did finish the Expanse series, so I finished Leviathan Falls. It was really satisfying. It's one of those, you read a long series like that, and as you get into the final stretch, the last 100 pages, you really slow down and you try to savor every character that you see, because that might be their last time,
mm-hmm.
On stage in the series. And that's a series that really dramatically expands the Expanse, in scope.
Mm-hmm.
The first book is, we're exploring our own solar system, and that's kind of the extent of what we can do. And then it just expands massively from that point, to get to the final books. And they Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, who co-authored that series. I think they did an excellent job of finding a way to wrap that up.
Nice.
Because it could almost expand infinitely from where it started. And I think they did a really nice job of putting a little bit of a bow on that in a way that I think was really satisfying.
Nice.
I immediately ordered the short story novella collection Memories Legion. They've put out novellas, here and there over the years, and they recently put them out in kind of an omnibus form.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed more expanse, so I ordered that right away. Also, while I've been doing all my schoolwork, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. One I've been listening to a lot is a Flat Pack History of Sweden, which is just a great history podcast. Olsa and Chris, they do a really excellent job putting that show together. I love the way it's formatted. It's kind of semi-conversational, but also structured in the way that they're presenting the information.
Mm-hmm.
So you come away feeling like you've learned a lot, but without sitting down and listening to a lecture necessarily.
Nice.
Sometimes I'm in the mood for that kind of history show. It's kind of a light listen if I don't want something quite so heavy, but really informative, and it's largely chronological. So if you kind of want a big story to dive into.
Excellent. Yeah, that is like, I always kind of look for those because I listen to a lot of them while I'm working. So like, I don't need it to be super dense.
If I can find a history podcast of a country that starts in the Paleolithic,
right,
give it to me. And then also, while we're talking about history podcasts, I do just want to point out another history podcast that we've actually mentioned on a previous episode, A History of the Inca. That's one that I really enjoyed. They just put out their final episode, wrapping up the stories that they're going to tell. So I know a lot of podcast listeners, especially with history podcasts, you like when a series is completed before you jump in, so you have an idea of what you're getting into. Now's the time to start A History of the Inca. We had talked about that on episode 72 when we talked about the San Pedro de Alcántara.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful podcast, very informative, covering a lot of stuff that I know certainly an American audience doesn't normally get, in your school education. You don't really hear a lot of these stories about the Inca, who are much more than just the civilization that Pizarro conquered when you're talking about the conquistadors in your history book. So yeah, definitely give that a listen. It's wrapped up, and now's the time to get to it.
That is one I don't think I maybe have listened to like the first couple episodes, but yeah, I will definitely plow through that at some point.
That one's also cool because Nick does the episodes in English, but then there's also kind of on a little bit of a delayed release is the episodes also in Spanish. So if you're interested in practicing your Spanish, give it a listen.
All right. Well, let's talk about today's topic, the HMS/HMT Aragon. She would be completed in June of 1905 by our friends at Harland and Wolff for the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. So I feel like two returning champions there, Harland and Wolff and the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. We've definitely talked about both of them before.
Right.
She's the product of Owen Phillips becoming the chairman of RMSP in 1903. A little bit of a visionary, I suppose, or just he had some common sense. He could see that the company needed larger ships for its routes to South America. There's some economies of scale at play there. The more people you can pack in there, the better.
That's not what Elon Musk would have us believe.
That's true. Yeah, it's better to separate everyone in their own car.
You can only be on the ship for an hour.
He can't even, he's completely broken Twitter, like as we are recording this. So he doesn't get a vote here. The vessel was 513 feet long. She had a 60-foot beam and a 31-foot draft. So I'd call her liner sized. I mean, she's a liner.
Mm-hmm.
In civilian life, I thought this was interesting. Her first class capacity is 306. Her second class capacity is 66. And her third class is 632. I guess second class only exists to push people into first class.
I think we've talked about similar stuff like that before.
We have.
Because I was always curious about the balance, about how there's this weird, almost perfunctory second class wedged in there that has, a lot less capacity than the others.
It almost feels like it's a bit of a buffer between like, oh, if first class is sold out, like you don't have to go into steerage at least.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's always interesting that like, I mean, maybe there's just not a lot of people in that economic bracket at the time.
Yeah.
You've either got the money for first or you don't, but it's always interesting to see that. She had a single funnel located amidship, and her first class dining saloon featured artwork of Christopher Columbus. So, I don't think we're talking about Titanic levels of luxury or Lusitania, but I mean, a very nice ship for its day. You wouldn't have been hurting.
Artwork depicting Christopher Columbus?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Like exploring.
I was saying, that sounds very expensive if that was art made by Christopher Columbus, though I've never heard of him as an artist, so maybe not very good.
But like everyone did everything back then. He was probably an artist, a poet.
A Renaissance man.
A Renaissance man, if you will. So in terms of cargo capacity, which is another important thing for the Aragon, considering she was going to South America, she had 5 holds, and some of these were actually refrigerated and some frozen. So she's able to carry goods like beef and fruit and things back from South America to Europe. So definitely trying to make the most out of her as far as these trips go. She actually is also notable that in 1913, she was equipped with a wireless telegraph. So what that tells me is like she's being maintained. They're putting money into her. There's not like a neglect thing going on here. Like they definitely care about this vessel. So the Aragon would become the first of what would be known as the A series of liners owned by the Royal Mail Steam and Packet Company. Of these, Amazon, Avon, Asturias, Arlanza, Andes, Alcantara, and Almanzora were all built by Harland and Wolff, while Workman Clark and Company built the Araguaia. So quite a few A's. They had to really dig deep in the old Webster's there for some A names, I think. Is there any common theme here, or are they literally?
I mean, there's a lot of Spanish related stuff.
I kind of noticed that there's a lot of Spanish stuff going on here.
Avon, I feel like, is a bit of an outlier there.
Yeah, is that King Arthur? Is that like where that is from?
There's a river in England called the Avon.
Yeah.
Which is funny because Avon, I believe, is just from the Celtic word for a river. And so the Avon River is called the River.
I just think of like Avon Cosmetics. Not going to lie.
I think Shakespeare, wasn't he from
Oh, yeah, I think you're right.
Stratford on Avon?
I think so.
We'll have to look that up and double check that before we include it in the episode.
This is outside of either one of our knowledge scopes there.
Asturias, I mean, that's historically important kingdom in Spain. That's kind of like the part of Spain that never falls to the Muslim invasion. So like historically, that's important. The crown prince of Spain is the Prince of Asturias, kind of like how in England you have the Prince of Wales.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I thought it was interesting that there was definitely like a Spanish lean on it, but like some of them clearly weren't.
Yeah.
So all of these vessels were not identical. They were built off of designs that kind of built off of each other. They tended to get larger as time went on, as these were built. So Aragon is kind of the first, and then each one of these is kind of improving on that design. So RMSP focused most of its efforts between Britain and the ports along the River Plate in South America. A typical route would be something like this. Depart Southampton for, is it Madeira?
Madeira and Tenerife.
Okay. So you would depart Southampton for Madeira and Tenerife, followed by trips to, you know what? I'm going to let you read this part because you can just roll through these.
Okay.
So a typical trip would follow a route such as...
It's just funny that the first one is Southampton.
I know. And then everything else. Imagine all the British people trying to say these places.
Southampton, Madeira and Tenerife, Pernambuco, Salvador de Bahia, and Rio de Janeiro, and Montevideo.
Yeah, so like you're moving around quite a bit along South America. Like they're not just going from Southampton to Rio and back or something. So she served like an important role as far as commerce, like along these river ports as well.
We talked about the River Plate in previous episode, and I don't remember why, or I think it was in one of our previous discussions of a ship that was on a similar route, because we had to talk about it servicing ports on the River Plate, which is basically it's technically a river, but it's much more like a big bay. So a lot of several of those South American capitals are located on the River Plate.
The Aragon was the start of RMSP's plan to modernize its South American service. Kind of what we've already touched on, like very obvious that there's demand here and that they need bigger vessels. Overall, the success of the A-series vessels resulted in a huge profit increase for the company. So like this program is very successful. As far as the Aragon goes, in 1906, she would make a total of 4 complete voyages, and she would net a total of 45,368 pounds. So that's profit. I used the Bank of England's website to convert that into 2023 money, and that's a profit of about $4.5 million.
Dollars or pounds?
Pounds. Yeah, and that's profit. So that's after you've taken all the expenses out and everything. So that's just money for the company. So that's a good year, I would feel like, making $4.5 million.
Yeah.
Good for the shareholders of RMSP.
And if this is being run by Netflix, they would be immediately canceling all of those routes.
Oh, we're gonna cancel her by the time it's done. I'm picturing the German Navy being sponsored by Netflix now.
She's going to exceed her rate limit by the end of the episode.
Yes, she will. In 1912, the British Admiralty decided to arm some of its passenger vessels, the Aragon among them. This isn't done like just out of the ether. This is done to match Germany, who the British had recently become aware of doing the same thing. This is all part of that general rise in tension.
Yeah, I'll say, listen to our Lusitania bonus episode where we get back in. We get into that, the back and forth between Germany and Britain as to who stepped over the line first. You know, it's like you started arming your civilian craft. No, you did that first. Well, we only did it because you were putting mines in the North Sea. And
Right.
so, well, we were only doing that because, you know, XYZ. So yeah, we talk a lot about that in that bonus episode.
There are some in the British Admiralty who were unsure how foreign countries would react to passenger vessels sporting British naval guns. I think that's a pretty valid concern. You know, the port's open to passenger vessels, and then you're sailing something that, like, arguably, like, a weapon of war, for sure.
It's like open carry, but just on...
But for a passenger ship.
Yeah.
It's fine in Texas.
Galveston Harbor just bristling with guns.
In 1913, Rear Admiral Henry Campbell recommended that vessels should be equipped with naval guns. However, they would not be provided with ammunition.
What?
That's the compromise.
That's the compromise. We're going to give you this that looks visibly aggressive, but you can't use it if you need to.
Basically, like, they're just setting up to get shot by the police. Like, you know what I mean? There's like walking around with empty guns.
Put a little orange cap on the guns to make sure they know it's fake.
This plan was endorsed by a British diplomat.
No.
Who might have the best name we've ever read. Would you like to read the British diplomat's name?
No, I don't want to, because it's almost the 4th of July.
Oh, yeah, we don't have to do this. British diplomat Sir Eyre Alexander Barby Witchert Crowe agreed and said, if nothing happens, it may be possible and easy, after a time, to place ammunition aboard.
So they're basically going to, like, push the envelope a little bit and see
what... basically, like, we're going to put these guns on there, and if no one says anything, we'll put ammo on later.
To connect with what we talked about last week, it's like open carrying a pistol on my hip going to Subway, but, like, it's not loaded the first few times, and then I see if anyone gets mad at me, and next time I start going around with it loaded. Let's
just admire that name one more time. Sir Eyre Alexander Barby Witchert Crowe.
Yes, of the Yorkshire Barby Witchert Crows.
But, like, they're all normal-ish names for the most part, but just so many of them.
Alexander Crowe would be a normal name.
Yes.
The rest are questionable.
Alexander Crowe sounds like he writes mystery novels.
Barby Witchert Crowe. That's the Barbie movie that we need right now.
Right. On April 25th, 1911, the Aragon would leave Southampton as the first defensively armored merchant ship operated by Great Britain. Her armament consisted of 2 QF 4.7-inch naval guns. I am not like a naval gun nerd, so I don't really know what that means, but it was enough for defense. The British government was happy to learn that there were no major objections from the South American ports that she visited, proving that overall the plan was a success.
I'd have to imagine that these South American ports, because the people who are traveling here, this is like tourist purposes, right?
I would imagine there's a lot of like business people and stuff.
But like people who are going to be spending money and injecting
Mhm.
money into the economies of these ports. So like, I guess I can't imagine them complaining too much.
Yeah, I would imagine that also like just the money from all of the British companies and stuff coming in and out, like to the
Yeah.
port and the people working in the port. Like, yeah, I don't think they're asking too many questions.
Not to say that you should be able to do whatever you want just because you're paying money to do it, but I'm just thinking if
Of
I'm
the way it works.
if I'm the mayor or a governor of one of these places, probably not complaining too much just because they put, just a two little guns on board. I don't really care that much.
As a result of the success, RMS Amazon, one of the previous A-series ships that we mentioned, would become the second armed vessel under the program. It's really good that they've been doing this because, like many other liners at the time, Aragon is pressed into service as a troop transport during World War I. She would take part in the Gallipoli campaign, which I know we've talked about a few times before. See the Britannic episode.
Also, a shout out to our friends at the Australian Gothic podcast. They recently did an episode where they discussed Gallipoli, the movie.
Nice.
The old one featuring very, very young Mel Gibson.
Nice. I actually need to listen to that.
Billed as Australia's finest gay war film. It's a good movie. It's a very good movie.
It is a good movie, actually. So during her service in the campaign, she would evacuate 1,500 service members to Alexandria and Malta. So mainly operating in the Mediterranean. On April 8th, she would take on the 4th Battalion of the Worcestershire Regiment and the 2nd Battalion of the Hampshire Regiment. These units were part of the 29th Division, which was due to take part in the landings at Gallipoli.
All I can think about is, like in Band of Brothers, for example, when someone has like a canteen or a flask or something, they might not know what's in it. Is it water or is it whiskey? Like with Nixon. And taking a sip out of one of the Worcestershire Regiment's canteens, and it's just sauce. It's just Worcestershire sauce.
I like Worcestershire sauce, but like I wouldn't want to drink it straight like that.
That's why they couldn't stay hydrated at Gallipoli.
Salt.
It's just the massive amounts of sodium.
As I'm sure most people listening know, Gallipoli is not a success. That whole part about her evacuating 1,500 service members, like that becomes vital in the aftermath of these landings. Later in the campaign, she would act as the British Forces Post Office, actually, for Base Army Post Office Y. Eventually, that would be moved on land, but she actually was a post office for a little while. In January of 1916, the Aragon was assigned to evacuate French and British personnel as part of the overall withdrawal from Gallipoli. Following this, she would operate in the Mediterranean before transferring to the Indian Ocean late in 1916. At this point, she's kind of moving around doing different things. Not a lot of stuff's going on, but late 1917 found the Aragon anchored off of Marseille for about 2 weeks before being ordered to make her way to Egypt. On board, she would carry 2,200 soldiers, 150 officers, 160 voluntary aid detachment nurses. These are actually women, so that's something to keep track of. And 2,500 bags of Christmas mail. These are all bound for the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, taking part in the Palestine campaign. This is a part of World War I don't think we talk about very much.
No, definitely doesn't get covered as much, like what's going on in Palestine, the Middle East. I mean, aside from like Lawrence of Arabia, I don't think much really gets discussed.
I just think it's very interesting because like these are complex, big operations, and they're not necessarily, remembered today. So for this voyage, she would sail with another transport, the Nile. I thought that was funny that it was named the Nile. It's going to Egypt. She would also be escorted by destroyers. The convoy would stop in Windy Bay, Malta for 4 days. And while they're there, the Aragon and Nile would pick up a fresh escort of destroyers. That would be the HMS Attack and 2 Japanese destroyers whose names I couldn't find. But like we were saying before, very interesting that the Japanese are operating in the Mediterranean in World War One.
Yeah, I didn't know that they had assets in the Mediterranean.
It also throws me off that Japan is on the side of the Allies in World War One.
Yeah, like their role doesn't get discussed a lot because I know they're busy grabbing up German colonies wherever they can in the Pacific because, they're allowed to do it now.
But also, like, to be fair, like, they got cut out of anything. Like, they definitely, like, thought they were going to have a seat at the table with the other, like, allies. And we were like, no, we're good. Thank you.
No shade on the Empire of Japan. But, yeah, like, you deserved a little bit of revenge here. But don't take it too far now. Yeah. Okay?
The HMS Attack was an Acheron-class destroyer built in 1911. We just had a good talk about what that is before the show. I did not realize there are two rivers in the Greek underworld.
There's also a Lawrence Arms song called Acheron River, if you remember that one.
I do. I actually just didn't know I didn't know the reference on that one. So she is armed with 2 BL 4-inch Mark 8 guns, 2 QF 12-pound guns, and 2 single 21-inch torpedo tubes. So pretty standard destroyer armament, definitely meant as like an escort vessel or a rapid response vessel. It's kind of what you want with you in the convoy.
I'm reading about the Acheron River on Wikipedia. It's in fact a real river that exists. There's pictures of it. It's in Greece, but also seen as the entrance to the underworld. And in older sources, that is in fact the river that you are ferried across. Although the later association of that with the river Styx is, I guess, attributed to Roman poets instead. So some differences of opinion over whether that is or is not really the same function as the river Styx.
Interesting.
Yeah. Virgil describes them as two different things, just as one of the other rivers in the underworld. Fun.
Someone should make a Greek podcast, a Greek myth podcast. I'm sure it doesn't exist. Go ahead and do that.
I think we're friends with like 8 of them on Twitter.
So overall, the Acheron class was well regarded for its handling at sea, and it's noted that despite having an open bridge, it was much drier than expected. I think we have an image of like most Navy ships as being really big. Like destroyers aren't very big. They are not. I think that the movie Greyhound does a pretty good job of showing you like the size of a destroyer. It's wet. Like when you're at sea, like you're taking a lot of water and stuff.
I pull out chart explaining difference between wet and dry destroyer. They tell me it's a good destroyer. I enter the destroyer. It's wet.
I mean, looking at this, like the Acheron class is only 250 feet long. Like, this is not very big, like out in the open ocean. I feel like sometimes people think that it's more like a battleship, and it's definitely more like a fishing vessel.
Yeah, I mean, as you can see on like if you play Civilization Call to Power, the destroyer is obviously much less beefy than your battleships are. Mm-hmm. They also can't bombard targets on land, only at sea, but they can attack submarines.
That's what they're there for. So the trip to Alexandria was not a pleasant one, and then the weather got worse. The convoy fought through a gale off of the Egyptian coast early on the morning of December 30th. No real issues other than the fact that it just isn't very pleasant to be out there in that. But eventually they get to the point the Japanese destroyers would split off with the Nile and make her way to Port Said, while the attack and the Aragon would continue towards Alexandria. Once they approached the harbor, Attack plotted a zigzag course ahead of Aragon while clearing the channel for mines. It's a pretty real concern that German mine-laying subs are around and, are trying to mine the approaches to the harbor.
That's a silly concern. Scared of ghosts here. Also, I think it's funny if you're the guys on these Japanese destroyers in this Mediterranean storm, like probably pretty pissed that like my buddies who are still over in the Pacific are just like having a ball, snapping up German territories left and right.
Yeah, you definitely drew the short end of the stick.
And I'm having to worry about getting torpedoed over here in this storm.
The crews on those Japanese vessels were either like they're really, really high achievers or they're really, really low achievers. I'm not sure which one. Like they either wanted to make a really good impression on the West or they're like, no, just get out of our way and go over there.
And it's interesting thinking about like time wise. You think you hear a lot about how the at that point senior military people in Nazi Germany, obviously a lot of them cut their teeth in the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they got their experience from. And then of course you're going to have similar instances here where I'm assuming a lot of your junior officers at this point in the Japanese Navy become those senior commanders who are operating in the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. So as Aragon approached, the armed trawler HMT Point Castle appears, and she uses her flags to signal "Follow me."
A quick question about the HMT, because I know before we'd seen that used as trawler. Does the HMT for the Aragon mean troop ship?
Transport.
Okay. Because I figured, and that's why when I was reading this, I was kind of confused at first because I was expecting her to be a trawler, and then she's definitely not.
Whereas like the HMT here is trawler. So like the Bedford, when we talked about that off in North Carolina, that was an HMT. So Aragon initially complies with the signal. However, Attack quickly jumps in and signals, "You have no right to take orders from a trawler." The destroyer then ordered Aragon to move back to sea, which Aragon complied with. This destroyer is like, no, you're mine. You will listen to me.
You've no rights to take orders from a lowly trawler.
That's exactly how it probably sounded too.
No, Shep, come along, follow me. You'll not be going along with those serfs over there with the trawler, no.
So one surviving officer stated,
"The only explanation that the writer can put forward is that the commander of the attack had a warning of mines in the channel, causing him to order Aragon to disregard Point's castle's 'Follow me.' Evidently, the enemy laid mines at the appropriate time in the knowledge that the ship would be kept out and thus present a target for torpedo attack."
I feel like they just got really lucky on the timing, probably.
Mm-hmm.
So at around 11 a.m., Attack and Aragon are about 8 miles away from the port, waiting on permission to enter. At 11 a.m., there's also another vessel operating in the same vicinity. The next character of our story here, the German Type UC-2 submarine, SMUC-34. Now, unlike Tanner, I don't spend a lot of my free time on U-boat.net. I don't have an account, so I don't really have any fun additional U-boat facts, but he might. I don't know. Did you look that up?
Joke's on you, because there's not even a lot about her on U-boat.net, so...
Is that because U-boat.net focuses on World War II more?
I was going to say, I wonder if there's some aspect of the German Navy in World War II that's more interesting to them than the one in World War I.
I don't know. It's a good question.
There's like a page, but there's very little information about her. However, when we talked about Vera Basunides and I was reading about the Austro-Hungarian fleet operating out of Pola, this is something that came up briefly in some of those, but it's more relevant to this episode, is that there was kind of a mini fleet of German vessels operating out of the same port, out of Pola, that were, under German command, German officers, but they simply operated out of Pola because it made sense in the Adriatic. And a lot of these, I believe they were all submarines. I don't think they had any surface vessels operating there. Some of these submarines did come directly from Germany, but some of these were actually transferred in pieces by rail to Pola and then assembled there in the harbor so that they could go out and raid Allied shipping. So kind of have a IKEA submarine put together here.
That's so funny to think about, transporting submarines by train. Suddenly, an explosion would rip through the aft section of the Aragon on the vessel's port side. This would result in an immediate list to starboard. Reacting quickly, Attack and Point Castle both move to attempt rescue. Kind of a best case scenario if this is going to happen. Like, at least you have vessels to respond, right? That's a good thing. Rescue should happen. So moving over to the Aragon, immediately evacuation procedures are underway. Voluntary aid detachment nurses were put into the first lifeboats launched. And as we so often see, a lot of times the first lifeboats launched are not full. However, there's a ton of men jumping into the water, and they're very quickly able to rescue some of the survivors that are in the water. Again, fortunate that we have larger vessels nearby, the lifeboats are able to transfer the first load of survivors onto the 2 trawlers that are on scene before going back to rescue more. So there's vessels responding from the harbor and stuff too. So there are quite a few vessels operating in the area now. In addition to these lifeboats, Aragon is able to deploy her life rafts. Although in the process of these inflating, one of her lifeboats is actually destroyed. So kind of a net neutral there, I suppose. And survivor accounts state that the crew worked to launch lifeboats until they stood waist deep in the water. From what I was reading, this was very orderly. The crew did their job. People were doing what they were supposed to do in this circumstance. From the North Star of Lismore, New South Wales, but appearing originally in the London Daily Chronicle,
the vessel had taken a very decided list. When I tell you that some of the crew were up to their waists in water, whilst they were launching the boats, you'll realize that the work was carried on under great difficulties. I shall never forget the magnificent courage of the nurses. It was a case of women first, but those nurses would gladly have given up their places to the soldiers. 2 or 3 of them made a protest as we were hurrying them into the boats. "Let us take our chances with the Tommies," said one sister. But of course, we had our orders, and the nurses were first. They showed no sign of fear, and the soldiers gave them a hearty cheer as we got them safely away in the boats. If the crew are proud of nothing else, they pride themselves on the fact that 160 nursing sisters were not only saved, but also that not any of them even got their feet wet.
Yeah, I think that's a really good quote. I mean, I think it does show how professional the evacuation was, and it seems handled the way that you'd want this to be handled.
Mm-hmm.
This is not an Oceanos situation. So let's go back to the attack. I really hate the name of this ship because every time I see attack, I think of it as the attack, something.
The concept of the ship being attacked. Yeah, it's very confusing.
Yeah. Attack was able to position herself alongside the Aragon, allowing for the rapid transfer of men who were fit enough to use the lines drawn between the vessels. As the attack worked to pick up survivors, it was clear that the Aragon was going down quickly. During this time, Trooper James Werner Magnuson of the New Zealand Mounted Rifles, who was on board the Aragon still, saw survivors struggling in the water. He leapt in and immediately set out to get survivors to lifeboats. Magnuson would then return to the Aragon and rejoin the men in his unit, ultimately being lost when the Aragon went down. So he did the reverse Birkenhead thing almost. He got back on. And then it's well, I have to get back to my unit now.
A lot of similarities there to the Birkenhead.
So approximately 15 minutes after the torpedo impact, the master of the vessel, Captain Bateman, gave the order of every man for himself. The remaining crew, now relieved of her duties, immediately made their way over the side of the liner. As this is going on, the bow's continuing to rise out of the water, and ultimately 5 minutes later, the Aragon slips below the surface. As water rushed through the compartments of the vessel, a second explosion occurred. Would you like to guess why?
Is it all of the Mediterranean Sea pouring into the boilers?
I was really hoping you were going to say the illegal ammunition or something that she was carrying.
All of the gun cotton hiding in her bowels?
Yes. No, it is the cold seawater and the hot boiler interacting. As we know at this point, so often you see this happen, that secondary explosion. And it is why you sometimes get conspiracy theories about things.
Mm-hmm.
From the same Northern Star article, one survivor's account of the ship's final moments.
I swam hard to get clear of the ship, but it was a terrible time. Hundreds of men were in the water, and pieces of wreckage strewn about in vast numbers. After swimming about for a long time, I was picked up. But I think I owe my life to the fact that I was without boots. Many of the fellows had all their clothes on as well as heavy boots. They must have found it very difficult to remain afloat.
Yeah, I can imagine if you're in your full kit, dressed for battle, that would not be fun. The attack now found herself crowded with nearly 400 survivors in various states of injury, including many men just laying out on the deck and dying from their injuries. Suddenly, and without warning, an explosion rips through the destroyer. The force was so violent that the vessel immediately broke into two. The explosion also opened up the vessel's fuel bunker, and this resulted in thousands of gallons of fuel being dumped into the sea and coating the men who were already struggling to survive. It now became obvious that the German U-boat had struck again.
As I was reading the notes, and I try to read them just from start to finish, and it was right before this that I realized, like, with all the stuff going on in the water transferring, that I was like, I wonder where the U-boat is. Because in like
Right.
the Lusitania, we had read some stories about U-boats basically torpedoing one vessel and then kind of waiting around to poach a few more that come to respond, resulting in that blanket order that, hey, if a ship radios that they've been torpedoed, do not go and rescue them, because it's either made up or it's an intentional trap. So,
Right.
and I guess here's our answer as to where the U-boat was.
So the remaining lifeboats in the water now work to ferry men to the other trawlers that were on scene. A survivor from the Aragon described the second attack this way.
I believe that the second torpedo, which sent the destroyer to the bottom, had been saved for the Aragon, because it was not until the Germans were satisfied that the troop ship was doomed that they attacked the destroyer.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I don't know, it's plausible, right? That we know these torpedoes, especially in World War I, are not very reliable. Like, did they just get incredibly lucky to get 2 kills with 2 torpedoes?
Well, and also it shows you, again, what we talked about Lusitania is how economical these captains have to be, because especially in the First World War, they don't carry that many. You know, some of these are carrying 6 or 8 torpedoes. And, you know, this is a mine laying submarine. So I'm assuming they probably have even less. And in this case, the captain is Horst Obermüller.
Did you learn that on uboat.net?
And contrast this with what we saw, was it 2 episodes ago? And that was World War II. We had a captain with like 3 or 4 misses on a stationary target. He had some misfires also. But then here, we've got a guy in the First World War who seems to be just like batting 1,000, taking these guys down. So yeah, just either he's very lucky or he had a good batch of torpedoes. He's
like the Shohei Ohtani of submarine captains. He can mine, he can torpedo.
He can do it all.
The remaining lifeboats in the water now work to ferry men to the other trawlers that were on scene. You know, like we had said, many of them were responding to the initial explosion when the second one happened. Ultimately, the search for survivors would be called off the next day. This is due to the auxiliary vessel HMS Osmania hitting a mine. This would result in the loss of another 197 nurses and sailors. And you have to wonder, like, did the same U-boat lay that mine?
Right.
If that's the case, like, this man is absolutely on a tear.
Just being an absolute terror out here, Horst Obermüller. Also, not the first time we've seen a search cut short because of additional casualties. I think we saw that in I want to say it was the Admiral Nakimov, where I think 1 or 2 divers were killed attempting to get to the wreckage. And that's kind of when they called it off, saying we don't want to lose any more people because of this.
So in total, 610 of the 2,700 who were on board the Aragon perished. That's about 23%. So I don't know. I mean, for a torpedo attack, I suppose that's not the worst thing. But you do have to wonder how many more people would have survived if the attack had not been attacked.
Right.
It is like, I'd love to see the breakdown of that. Like, how many people were actually lost on there. Among the men lost was the master, Captain Bateman. He's actually last seen jumping overboard. The surviving second officer stated that he heard Captain Bateman exclaim to the attack's bridge that he would demand an inquiry into why his ship had been sent back from the port. He literally yelled it to the bridge of the attack when they were next to each other before he jumped overboard. So it definitely seems like there was some confusion there as to, like, why did this happen? Like, why did we get sent back out? And to be fair, like, that decision only looks bad in hindsight. Like, very much if, like, that was not policy and procedure, then, you know, that's probably why the destroyer was so upset. But yeah, it definitely looks bad.
The back and forth and kind of the confusion there, it all kind of stems from the fact that, you know, entering port is the most dangerous time for these ships, you know, when there's U-boats about, because that's what they're waiting for. We talked about that with several of our episodes, how the timing is so important. You've got to time the tides right, the timing, because, you know, if you've got to stop and turn around and circle, that's that's perfect for if I am a U-boat commander.
Yeah, that loitering time outside of a port is the absolute most dangerous time for these ships. Overall, 19 of the ship's crew perished in the attack, while hundreds of soldiers were killed. However, none of the volunteer nurses were killed in the attack.
A tough bunch.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you can see that like the crew did an excellent job working with what they had. Had it not been for that second attack on the destroyer attack, like this would have been a very different story.
This is probably an unknowable fact, but you do have to wonder with as some of the tactics displayed by these U-boat commanders is like, was this the plan, or did he get lucky and say, oh, like I actually have a shot at this destroyer now?
I feel like reading so much about Lusitania and like how Schwieger did things, like so much of it was chance. And I feel like this is chance as well. I just feel like there's no way you could plan for it to go this well, actually, and like sound sane. Like people would laugh at you, I think, if you said, well, this is my plan. I'm going to go 2 for 2 with my torpedo shots. One thing I'm actually surprised about is the lack of memorials to the sinking. I did a few searches, but I didn't really come up with much. Overall, like there's not a lot of depth of information on this. I don't know how much, if you looked around at all and saw much, but.
Yeah, I mean, some of the databases I normally use for these, where you can usually at least find like a newspaper reference, and there's really not much that I was able to come across.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's because it's, it's relatively late in the war. There's a lot of ships getting torpedoed by this point. It's the Mediterranean.
I feel like it might be a combination of like all of those factors. Kind of, it's the end of the war. We don't want to talk about the bad things. We won. And that it is in the Mediterranean, and like that's not Jutland. You know what I mean? It's not, you're not defending home. You're in the Mediterranean, but we don't want to talk about that either. Yeah,
and like there's no big capital ships involved with this. So I mean, you kind of understand why the story gets not as much coverage because, but like in other circumstances, what were our casualties at for this one? 610. Yeah, like in other circumstances, like a ship that loses 600 people, that's a massive story. That's very high up there in terms of like deadliest shipwrecks in a given region. But yeah, it's like it gets washed out by so many other horrific things happening in the First World War. By this point, it's kind of like Robert Evans talks about it, and they did a 2-part series on Stockton Rush, the Titan submersible, and contrasting the news coverage between that and the migrant wrecks in the Mediterranean. And he talks a lot about how it is just natural human instinct. You get overwhelmed with these things, and you can't possibly give the attention to all of these stories, despite the fact that individually they are, the magnitude of it is enormous. When there's so many other of these similar stories to tell, some of them are going to get lost in the mix.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. These are always the ones I like to do where it is a big event that's maybe underrepresented. But that'll be our story for this week.
Oh, I did just want to add in.
Oh, go ahead.
We always like to look at typically, because so many of these U-boats are lost in action. Just a horrendous casualty rate for U-boat crews and commanders. The UC-34 actually survived the war. She ended up being scuttled in Pola Harbor in, I think, October of 1918. So one of the few who made it through, but just probably not seen as super useful after the fact. Especially, I believe she was one of the ones who was assembled at Pola, so probably not a huge loss to get rid of her in Pola.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, it is interesting that it survived the war, because so few did. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We will be back next week, and we'll put out some bonus content this week, hopefully. So hope you guys enjoy, and we'll talk to you. Bye.